of the opposition. We probably do this as well. We're probably guilty of trying to portray Microsoft as these, control freaks, and people like to use Ballmer as their scapegoat and kind of show him running around and dancing and saying that this is Microsoft. But this is one of the FUD tactics in general.
I was going to say, before we go into anything, looking into any specifics, the other sort of interesting point about the Russian story was it's like the Bush doctrine of keep repeating something often enough and people will start to believe it, and hopefully, from their perspective, hopefully it'll become the truth, or be accepted as the truth. And it is funny that the company who sends out all the assassins in the form of other companies and other partners and all these sabotage at various things, Microsoft essentially are the hirers of these assassins. Whether they go out and do it autonomously or not, they're essentially working for the Assassins Guild, known as Microsoft. That's a Discworld reference for those who are curious.
Yeah, I want to quote something. They usually use words like ecosystem. They refer to independent software developers or vendors or something of that sort. And one of the European delegates for the government in Europe, he actually compared Microsoft to Scientology in 2000 and I think around 2008, when they did the whole OXML thing in France, where they were bribing and threatening and manipulating the processes and using their business partners to move things around and to try and toss people who disagree. And that's just not something that's unique to Microsoft. I think any large corporation has the ability to do that, but to try to ignore it happens wouldn't be so smart, because it happens everywhere. And if we're talking about software, Microsoft is still bigger in terms of staff, in terms of the number of partners they have out there, in industry, software developers who build upon Windows. So they have a lot of strength and a lot of ability to run people around, attacking everything that's a threat to the Windows platform. And that's what they do. And we need to try and explain. I was hoping in this show, and I think it was actually the team's idea, that we should go through certain patterns we know and certain examples we know of what they do.
There's two parts to this really, because it's nice to have a discussion on some of the antics that we've experienced ourselves and maybe read about other people experiencing. But it's also nice to just mention that Microsoft, whilst is a large company, is doing what every other good company, and I say that in inverted commas, should be doing. They're trying to make their product the only product available. And we would expect any company to want that when they start out in a venture of any sort of software, that they would want to be the only provider of that particular service or software, and that's the way business works. I think where I'll say irritates, which is probably the wrong word, where it upsets me, is that in order to do this, it removes the choice from the end user. So whilst we obviously have our opinions on free software and Linux, which is obviously an alternative to Windows, it's the person with the loudest voice, which is Microsoft at the moment, who gets heard, like Gordon says, by repeating the same thing, hopefully with the aim that people will listen to it and believe it finally, and it finally comes true. And I think that's the sort of battle. It's not so much the battle against what Microsoft says, it's the battle to educate people that actually have a choice and to say, well, look, yeah, you've heard what Microsoft have said, you've heard what we've said, now go out and try it yourself and form your own decision. Because, as I've said before, the only person I agree with on the internet 100% is myself, and we've all got our own different viewpoints. So, I mean, I've got that article up at the moment, the Russian article, but if we're going to move on from that, there was one very quick example, which wasn't so much FUD, but it was more what I would regard as pressure, if neither of you have a problem for me to mention it now. It was the case recently, and I can't remember the dates, but it was to do with Dell, when they printed up on their website that Linux was more secure than Windows, and then I believe it was subsequently taken down very, very quickly afterwards. We never got to find the reason why that occurred. I don't know, Roy, if you had any other information on that. I sort of lost the story at the time.
I wrote about it like 5 times because we kept receiving some more information. I think it was interaction with Dell. They put down a page, or they move the page to a different URL and try to distance it a bit deeper inside the site. So I'm not sure about this, but one method of not censoring something is to move the thing around. I think one person here is guilty of doing that. That's not myself. But basically saying, well, you can have the freedom of speech, or we can have this piece of content, but it will be put in a separate part of the site. What Dell, I think, did is they had a more of a kind of a frontal primary type of page that compares the operating system, and maybe they had a secondary page where you can use the same content or the same story, or maybe it's a blog post or something, and you can keep the same story, but I think the main page where people could compare and consider the different choices they had was definitely watered down, so to speak. So you didn't have the explanations of security. I think it's just security that was changed, and I think the page itself presented 10, was it 10 or maybe just some number? I think it was 10 arguments in favor of Ubuntu in this case. It probably applies to all kinds of other distributions, and I suppose in a separate show we could talk about why Dell only sells one brand of desktop Linux. That's a separate story. But they were trying to give the impression that you do get a better offer when it comes to security if you choose Linux, without giving too much explanations, but just basically say you will be more secure. Now, most people will say, well, practically you are more secure. Now, what the reason is for the security, I suppose that's a separate topic. I will claim that's because it is built better, not because it has fewer people using the operating system on a desktop. But that wasn't even part of the discussion. I think the discussion was, will you be more secure if you buy Linux from Dell? And the answer is yes, because we know how many infections roughly you have with Windows, and we know how many you have with Linux. Now, the reason they had to change that is because it received a lot of publicity. People obviously try to appeal to authority, and Dell is an authority on actually both servers and desktops, and they start doing phones now. But when Dell says something about an offer of what's a better hard drive or an operating system or all kinds of other things, they will be used as an argument for or against something. And sites like Dig or Slashdot would use this to say, well, Dell is saying this. And of course, what I imagine is what happened is one member of staff wrote his opinions about this thing. It seemed like more of a blog post or some thing that one person or maybe a few people did. But for the company as a whole, the divisions deal with licenses from Microsoft and volume licensing and everything. They weren't quite as happy because they would get what's Microsoft might call blowback or retaliations, and it did happen before. So we know Microsoft was talking about whacking Dell, and I'm quoting the word whack whacking is something the word they use to talk about the way they work with companies like Dell and HP. They like having this diversity of companies because they can play favorites with them, and they can have the company compete who's the so-called favorite son or daughter of Microsoft, who's going to sell the computers for the cheapest price, and who Microsoft is going to give the best licenses, license fare or whatever to. So Dell basically was at risk of getting Microsoft too angry, and they had to change the page. But that goes back to around May, I think, or June, or...
Yeah, it was early in the year. I mean, just quickly, because I want to bring out Gordon's view on this. But Gordon, in respect of security and obviously what Dell said, would you say Linux is inherently more secure, or more secure because of its size and the size of the target is compared to, say, the Windows deployment on the desktop? What's your view on that?
Well, I would start by saying, haven't you been paying attention? It's better with Windows, don't you know?
Yes,
they all say so. It's better with Windows. It should be definitive.
Never. They get paid.
Sarcasm was.
We should talk about this later. Actually, that's a very.
Yeah, I couldn't resist. That was sarcasm for those who didn't detect the glint of humour. But yeah, I mean, Dell has always been a bit schizophrenic when it comes to this type